Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I'm your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm delighted to welcome a very senior professional who was earlier naval officer from Melbourne, Australia, Mr. Subroto Mukherjee. Subroto, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Ashutosh. It is indeed a pleasure and an honor to be on your show.
Thank you. Subroto is the founder and chief executive officer of Moulting Caterpillar, LLP, which is a boutique executive coaching and leadership development consultancy. He's a former naval officer who was a submariner and has commanded 2 warships. He has also extensive corporate exposure at the senior management and CXO levels. So Subroto, before we start talking about coaching and consulting, tell me a little bit about your own journey in brief.
Okay, thank you for inviting me, and I'll just go over it briefly because it's a rather long journey covering nearly 40 years.
Mm-hmm.
So I started my career in the Indian Navy way back in 1984, and I took premature retirement in 2008. During the span of close to about 24 years, I was fortunate to have very good leaders and mentors,
Mm-hmm.
And that afforded me, a lot of visibility and a lot of new opportunities and roles. So some of them were, so I'm a submariner. I have served on board 4 submarines, on board 7 ships, including command of 2 ships. One of them was during the Kargil War.
Mm-hmm.
So one doesn't hear too much about the Navy during Kargil War, but in the background, even though I would be biased to say it, I think we won the war.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I was commanding a ship then. I was the liaison officer to our late Prime Minister, Mr. Rajiv Gandhi. For some time, I was also the chief instructor of the Naval Academy, where all officers go for basic training.
Mm-hmm.
And I was the first COO of India's only tri-service command in the Andaman Nicobar Islands.
Okay.
So these are some of the highlights. Of course, there were many more roles. After I completed my journey with the Navy, I decided to move on to the corporate world. And I was the CEO of a sort of startup called Synergy RMS, Relationship Management Services Private Limited, for about a year. Then I moved on as the head of a strategic business unit with a real estate major.
Mm-hmm.
And from there, I moved on to the venerable Cipla, which most of us know as one of India's largest pharmaceutical companies. And in the 85-year history of Cipla, I was given the, responsibility to start a new vertical. So I started a global vertical, headed it, brought it into profitability before I moved on to looking after operations in the Australia, New Zealand region. And then finally, I decided to strike out on my own, and that's how Moulting Caterpillar LLP.
Wonderful. So tell me a little bit about Moulting Caterpillar. I'm assuming the name comes from the fact that once you go through working with you, you come out as a butterfly. But tell me about the work that you do.
You're absolutely right there. So, after a lot of thought, I hit upon this name because I said, it's more of a transformational process, from the not so pretty looking caterpillar into a butterfly. So what I do is, there are 2 key parts of my, offerings. Of course, I speak to, but one is the executive coaching part, and the other one is a leadership development program. So mainly we find that when you come, this is aimed towards the senior leadership, in any company. So we find that people generally hit a glass ceiling. So in coaching, there are basically 3 parts, which, where you come into a awareness, acceptance, and action part. So what is interesting is when you come across young leaders, because like in the IT sector, etc., you have leaders at the top who are quite young age-wise. So here you find that their, acceptance, awareness and acceptance of what is limiting them is quite fast. But, the ability to continue, to have patience to continue with the action is a challenge. Now, when we come to the other established organizations, the old school ones like, say, pharma or FMCG, etc., where the leaders are a little older, you find a slight change in that, where you find that the leaders are aware, but they find it a little difficult to accept that they have these limiting beliefs, because they've taken so many years to reach the apex position that they don't agree to that. So that's where the challenge is, and that's where we spend a lot of time to get them to accept it. And once they accept it, they're quite disciplined in following up with the actions. So basically, I bring in this self-awareness and I catalyze the change into efficiency, all-round efficiency, whether it's for the organization, for the people, for the families. So all around. That's basically what we do.
Wonderful. And as a former naval officer who has led large teams, what would you say have been some of your learnings from the Navy that is supporting your work as a coach?
So I think my naval stint has given me a deep understanding of the human psyche. How people operate under pressure. What is it that holds people together? What are the values which generally people look up to? So these deep learnings have really helped me bridge that gap, because in the armed forces, in the Navy, etc., you live with a lot of camaraderie. You live together. You're dependent on each other, which is not so in the corporate world. In the corporate world, we sort of exist in silos. So how do you bring that into the corporate world to bring about a happier and more productive space where people can actually rely on each other for an overall growth? Right.
You also focus on, and I'm quoting you, why we do what we do and how we do it. Help me understand these three phrases and give me an example if it's possible. I don't want any names, of course.
So, this is something which I noticed, that we spend a lot of time in the corporate world just doing. For example, if I'm into the real estate sector, we're building buildings, right? We say, okay, I'm going to build buildings using XYZ technology. It's going to have all these facilities. If you come into the pharma sector, you say, okay, I'm going to produce medicines. But why are we doing it? Because that's what separates us from the rest. So let's say you're into the pharma sector. If you know the why, the purpose of why you're doing it. So I'm doing it because I want to have medicines available for all, to the poorest section. So that becomes my purpose. If I'm building buildings, I say, okay, I want to build buildings which will last 5 generations, which is there for generations to come. So what is the purpose behind it? And how do we do it? Because there are ways of doing it. I mean, are you ethical in the way you do it? Is your method sustainable? So these are very important, because what you do is very easy to know. But why you do something and how you do it are what separates the excellent organizations from the run-of-the-mill ones.
Interesting. My next question is that, and I think you answered it partly. Then my question is that how has your background supported your coaching philosophy, your style, and your values?
So my background is one where pretty direct. I don't tend to beat about the bush. So, you quickly get to the center of the problem and, address it. So I have a pretty direct style, to say so. And I'm also very people-centric, in the sense I'm a firm believer that excellence is dependent on your people, and your brand is also dependent on your people. So if you look after your people, and if you look after the leadership, you will automatically have an excellent product, and you'll have longevity. Today, the new organizations which are coming up, the longevity is very, very reduced. 10 to 15 years life cycle, they just disappear.
Right.
So how do we bring that back? How do we have longevity? How do we have, huge organizations which have a wonderful base, like say the Tatas or the Ford or etc. companies like that.
Okay. And my next question to you, Subroto, is that, most of us have had people in our lives who have shaped our thinking, our perspectives. I wanted to ask you, how have you been shaped by some people in your life, and how are they influencing you as a coach today?
I think the two people who have shaped my life the most are my father and my wife. Actually, my father was also an ex-naval officer, and what he taught us was that integrity is central to whatever you do. Integrity both in your professional, output and your personal behavior. And I think that has been a guiding principle for me all throughout. Integrity at the cost of, maybe growing in your profession or anything else short term. And my wife, she is, she used to work very closely with Mother Teresa. So she is, a person who is gratitude personified. She is always giving. She just doesn't look at, what she's going to get in return. In the sense, she even, we suddenly find unknown strangers in our house because she's seen someone wandering on the streets, and she brings them in and looks after them till they're okay for a month or so, and then they go back to their families. So, the selfless giving, to be able to do that. So these are two guiding factors which have played a big role in shaping.
Thank you. My next question is that, you had an amazing journey, as a naval officer in the private sector, and now as the founder of Moulting Caterpillar. But before we started recording, you also said that a very large number of your family members were in the defense services in India. So my question is, how does the historical context in which you were raised impact your view of yourself, your clients, and your coaching?
Ashutoshji, that's a very, very interesting question, and it requires deep delving. But I think I have never really thought of it, but now that you've mentioned it, what I feel is that this legacy which is there from where I have, emerged, makes me put the organization and the people before myself. So for me, it's always been, the organization and the people and the country before my own needs. And sometimes the family may say it's a little detrimental because, you end up ignoring them and spending more time on people and organization who are outside the ambit of your family. But so be it. It brings me a lot of peace and happiness, and that's how I've been living life.
Okay. And again, what are some of your unique perspectives that you bring to your coaching relationships? Each one of us who's a coach brings in some of their own unique perspectives, and I'd love to understand what are yours.
My perspectives are that, every individual has their own journey, which is unique. And, we are no one to judge them. You may have similarities, but it's never the same.
Correct.
Because even if one factor changes, it changes the entire journey. So when I coach, I really don't judge anyone. Everyone is right. And I am just there for the person I'm coaching. And I am there to help them move on in their journey and not to, impose my views onto their lives.
And a related question, when you were in the Navy, and I'm sure you're in touch with a lot of people, is coaching something that's coming into the defense services from the senior officers to the junior officers?
So in the armed forces, actually, coaching is less. It's mentoring which happens. So I I think the basic reason is because people don't have the luxury of time which is required for coaching. So mentoring happens in an unofficial kind of a way. And though it is systemic, but in a way it's unofficial because you don't really assign a mentor to a mentee, but it happens.
Okay.
Coaching is something which still hasn't come in, and I have my doubts whether it will come in the near future just because of that time factor.
And probably the hierarchical structure.
That's right.
Wonderful. My next question to you is on culture. Subroto, you come from a country which is incredibly multicultural. You're living in a country which is also multicultural. And yet, when you look at cultures and how we all think, even within India, we accept different norms of working, different norms of working with other people. So my question is, what is your view on does culture impact coaching?
Ashutoshji, I think coaching is agnostic of any external influences, but culture does very closely impact the person being coached, because culture shapes the way we think, right? Because as we all know, culture is basically shared values, what we believe in. So depending on who is being coached and what is the environment they have grown up in, they would have cultural imprints, which would then transform into either limiting beliefs or supporting beliefs which they have in their head. And that's how it comes into coaching. But coaching as a process per se is agnostic of culture.
Okay. The reason I asked you the question on culture is that whenever I have spoken to a lot of Indian people, and Indians tend to say, let my work speak for itself rather than me talk about the work I'm doing. And when I speak to Americans, they love to talk about what they are doing. That's the reason I asked you, this culture impact coaching, but I understand what you're saying. So let's move on to the next question. And that is that, you mentioned that you basically work with very senior leaders. What is the difference between coaching senior leaders and younger leaders?
I think I touched upon it at the beginning of this conversation. But what I find is, actually, when you look at the senior leaders and middle leaders, it generally becomes a generational aspect. So when you touch upon the generations, if you look at Gen Z or millennials, which we talk about, and some of the millennials are already in leadership positions.
Yeah.
So what I have noticed is very brilliant, very intelligent, but on the downside, probably from a leadership aspect, is impatient, and they're not very amenable to taking setbacks. And this is probably because of how the generation has grown up. It's our fault. We brought up this generation in a way where we sort of, kept them away from failures or early setbacks in life. You didn't see, anyone failing in school till the 10th or 11th. You found, the education system where you said, okay, overlook grammatical errors, do not put a red ink on their, papers. So there was all positive strokes till they finished their board and suddenly they face the real world. So somewhere they work very well in an environment which gives them positive strokes. But when they face a setback, it pushes them back. They get a little emotional, and that's why we have so many mental health issues coming up in the, as we see around us. It's just blossoming and increasing. I think that's the only thing where there is a difference. Whereas for the senior leadership, they are more pondering because they did not have this fast-paced tech atmosphere when they were starting off. So they're a little skeptical about trying out something new because they're risk averse, because they've really grown that. So the main difference which I see is risk averseness versus impatience. In the two separate generations. The younger generations want to experiment. They don't mind taking risks, and they want to move on. The elder generation wants to nurture what they have built. They want to test before they go in. So yes, that's the major difference.
Wonderful, wonderful. And my last question to you, Subroto, and this is for the thousands of people who will listen to our conversation. Based on your own amazing journey as a naval officer and someone who's been in the corporate world, lived in India and outside India, what would you say are 3 lessons that you would want our viewers and listeners to take away from your own journey and from our conversation today?
What I have come to believe, with my journey through life, it may or may not work for everyone, but this is what I've come to believe. That one is follow your passions for lifelong happiness.
Yeah.
If you want to be happy, nothing like a convergence of passion with your daily work. For example, if you love playing golf and you become a professional golfer,
correct,
it's fantastic. So yes, that's one. Second one is don't compromise your values. It's not worth it in the long run. You may win a battle, but you'll lose the war, because
correct,
as you grow older, it'll become more and more difficult for you to sleep well and look at yourself in the mirror.
Correct.
And the third and very important thing, which a lot of people call out, but many people, and especially in our younger days in the journey, we don't realize this, that family is more important than work. Because work is very fickle.
Yeah.
You're there, you could be told tomorrow, thank you, do not come anymore for whatever reasons. It doesn't mean that you were not good.
Yeah.
The business may have failed, environment is different, but it's only your family which is there throughout your journey, up or down. So that family time is very, very important for the future of your own life and career.
Very interesting. And on that note, Subroto, and your 3 wonderful lessons, which is follow your passion for lifelong happiness. Second, you said was don't compromise on your values, which is so, so important. And the third one, which very few people recognize when they're young and they seem to understand it as they get older, is family is more important than work. Thank you so much for speaking to me about your journey. Thank you for speaking to me about all the work that you've been doing as a coach in Moulting Caterpillar. Thank you also for giving me some of your thoughts about coaching. Thank you again and good luck.
Thank you so much, Ashutosh ji. It was wonderful, and I truly, enjoyed our conversation. And thank you so much for having me on your show.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.